The wedding invitation sat unopened on the edge of Pedro Whitaker's marble kitchen island, pristine and glowing under the filtered morning light. Thick, creamy cardstock, the kind that whispered old money and careful curation. Gold lettering gleamed at the corners, and even from a distance he could make out the embossed initials, G and M, Gianna Bellamy and Matthias Sterling. Pedro had known it would come. He'd heard the whispers, caught the hints during society dinners, seen the flickers of engagement announcements creeping across his social feeds. But something about seeing it there, physically in his kitchen, in his world, sliced a thin line across the calm he'd carefully built around himself. He didn't open it. Instead, he poured black coffee into a white porcelain cup and leaned against the floor-to-ceiling window of his downtown Charleston penthouse. From here, he could see the harbor glistening in the morning sun, boats slipping silently across the water, and the genteel city slowly waking up in its quiet, curated charm. Pedro Whitaker was Charleston's quiet storm. At 45, he'd turned a modest boutique real estate firm into one of the Southeast's most revered luxury development empires. Everyone in the city either wanted to work with him or be seen shaking his hand. He had money, taste, power, and most days he had silence. The kind that comes when your phone stops ringing with real conversation and only hums with transaction alerts. When the laughter at dinners fades before you've parked your car. When you realize you've built an empire with no one to come home to. He had made peace with the silence, or so he told himself, until that invitation arrived. He finally picked it up, tore open the seal with a sharp, controlled motion, and let his eyes scan the words. The pleasure of your company is requested at the wedding of Gianna Bellamy and Matthias Sterling. His mouth drew a slow, bitter smile. Gianna's name used to sit behind his on monogrammed towels. Once, her laugh echoed in this very room. They were together for 3 years, engaged for nearly 1. Then came the doctor's appointment that changed everything. The one that told him what he already suspected, that children were not part of his future. And for Gianna, that had been the line in the sand. I love you, Pedro, but I want a family, a real one. You can't give me that. She left quietly, with the grace only a Southern woman could make look polite while breaking you in half. Pedro placed the invitation back on the counter, walked to the living room and picked up his phone. He dialed. Don't tell me you're thinking of going, Sutton's voice said before the first ring ended. Pedro leaned against the leather couch, eyes fixed on the ceiling. It's tempting, don't you think? You want my honest opinion? Always. You show up at that wedding, and one of 2 things happens. You look like you haven't moved on, or you steal the entire spotlight. If you enjoyed this video, comment 1 to let me know. If not, comment 2. Your thoughts matter to me either way. Pedro chuckled softly. Wouldn't that be something? Why are you even considering it? There was a pause. Not long, just long enough. Because, Pedro said quietly, I want her to see what she walked away from. Sutton didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice dropped. And do you think that's going to make you feel better? Or worse? Pedro didn't answer. Instead, he walked to his rooftop garden, where the jasmine vines were just starting to open under the spring sun. The scent was sweet, nostalgic, suffocating. He ended the call. Later that evening, Pedro found himself wandering the cobbled paths near the Battery, where the ocean breeze drifted through the moss-covered oaks. He'd just finished dinner with a board investor and was walking back toward his parked car when something made him stop. A small movement under the awning of a closed bookstore caught his attention. 2 girls. Young. Quiet. Sitting close together under a thin blanket. One had her arm wrapped around the other like a protective shell. Their clothes were neat but worn, faces turned slightly from the wind. They weren't panhandling. They weren't crying. Just sitting there, still and strange against the swirl of Charleston's polite candlelit nightlife. Pedro stood there longer than he meant to. The older one looked up, meeting his gaze directly. Not with fear, with calculation. Challenge. He crossed the street slowly, stopping a few feet from them. "It's getting cold," he said. "You two okay?" The older girl didn't flinch. "We're fine." "You look hungry." The younger one peeked out from behind her sister. Her cheeks were pink from wind. Her hands clutched a small stuffed rabbit. Pedro nodded toward the corner cafe. "They've got hot chocolate that's almost too sweet. I'm buying." "We don't take charity," the older one said. He smiled. "It's not charity. It's cocoa, with whipped cream." There was a long pause. Then the older one stood, smoothing her skirt with a grace that seemed out of place. "I'm Genesis," she said. "This is my sister Josie. I'm Pedro." He held the door open as they entered the cafe. Warmth flooded over them, and Josie gave a small sigh of relief. They sat in a booth, quiet at first. Then Josie began to talk, about nothing and everything. Genesis, however, kept her answers short, watching Pedro closely. As the waiter cleared their plates, Pedro hesitated. "There's a wedding this weekend," he said slowly. "It's complicated." Genesis raised an eyebrow. "I'm expected to bring someone," he continued. "You two, you clean up well." Josie looked up. "You want us to come to a wedding?" "Just for the weekend. You'd have a safe place to sleep. Good food, new clothes, no strings. Then we figure out what's next." Genesis looked him over. Not just his clothes or face, but his posture, his tone, his eyes. "You're doing this to prove something to someone," she said flatly. "Yes," Pedro admitted, "but that's not the only reason anymore." Another pause. Then Josie whispered something in Genesis's ear. Genesis nodded slowly. "We'll think about it." Pedro reached into his wallet and handed her a card. "If you decide yes, call me. Anytime." That night, as he walked back to his car, he looked over his shoulder. They were still at the booth, heads bent together. He climbed into the driver's seat, leaned back, and closed his eyes for a moment. He could feel something shifting in his chest. Not excitement, not relief, something heavier, something that might change everything. But for now, he drove into the night, with the card still warm from her fingers in his coat pocket. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 a.m. Pedro was standing in his kitchen, barefoot, holding a half-empty coffee mug when the sound echoed through the penthouse. He wasn't expecting anyone. He didn't allow surprise visits. Not here, not in this space. But something about the timing made his chest tighten. He placed the mug down slowly and walked to the front door, pressing the intercom. "Yes?" A pause, then a clear, cautious voice. "It's Genesis." "And Josie." Pedro stared at the speaker for a moment before unlocking the door. When it swung open, the two girls stood there in the hallway, small backpacks on their shoulders, their faces freshly washed and serious. Josie clutched the same stuffed rabbit from the night before. Her curls were slightly damp, still smelling faintly of soap. Genesis stood taller than her age, her expression unreadable but alert. "We discussed it," she said, stepping inside. "We'll come." Pedro blinked, recovering quickly. "You're early." "We said morning." "It's morning." Josie smiled up at him. "You have a nice building." Pedro stepped aside, watching them walk past the foyer and into his world of glass and steel. The contrast was jarring. Two young girls, carrying everything they owned in worn canvas bags, walking across hand-knotted rugs and past modern sculptures. Josie wandered toward the floor-to-ceiling windows and pressed her nose lightly against the glass. "You can see the water," she whispered. It looks like the sky melted. Pedro let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Come on," he said gently. "Let me show you where you'll be staying." He led them down the hall to the guest suite. 2 beds, crisp linens, soft lighting. It had always been a space for clients, occasional out-of-town developers. It had never been used like this. Josie immediately dropped her bag on the nearest bed and bounced once, then flopped back dramatically. "It's like a hotel. Genesis, we get our own beds." Genesis stood in the doorway, not moving. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked. Pedro met her gaze. "Because I got a wedding invitation I didn't know how to face alone." Her expression didn't change. "She left me," he continued. "Gianna. We were engaged. I couldn't give her children. She couldn't pretend that didn't matter." "So you thought bringing us would make her jealous," Genesis said flatly. Pedro exhaled. "That was the first thought, yes. But things are changing." "Because we're here?" He nodded. "Because you're not what I expected." Josie sat up. "What did you expect?" Pedro smiled slightly. "I don't know, but not this." There was a long pause. Then Genesis walked into the room, placed her bag beside the bed, and looked at the large wardrobe. "We'll need dresses, something clean, something that fits." Pedro tilted his head. "You're very sure of yourself." "I've had to be." Josie tugged at Genesis's sleeve. "Can we take a bath now?" "You promised." Genesis nodded. "Yes, we'll get clean. Then we'll talk about what comes next." Pedro left them to it. In the hallway, he paused outside the door, hearing the faint sound of water and Josie's soft giggle echoing off tile. It was the first warm sound that had filled this home in months. By noon, a stylist had arrived. Pedro had made a call to his assistant, who arranged everything with no questions asked, just a raised eyebrow and a knowing tone. The stylist, Michelle, laid fabric samples across the dining table and started taking measurements. Josie stood barefoot on a velvet stool, laughing as Michelle gently wrapped a tape measure around her tiny frame. "You're tickling me." Genesis watched closely, her eyes scanning colors, comparing textures. "That navy would bring out Josie's eyes," she said with confidence. "And something in emerald for me. Nothing shiny. Simple elegance." Michelle blinked, then smiled. "You've got an eye, sweetheart." Pedro stood in the corner, arms crossed, quietly watching. These weren't ordinary children. Their speech, their posture, their presence. It all hinted at something else. A past more refined than what they'd let on. He could feel it, see it, but he didn't press. Later that afternoon, the new dresses arrived, custom fit, elegant but modest. Josie twirled in her navy dress, giggling as her skirt fanned out. Genesis stood tall in emerald green, her auburn curls pulled into a soft twist by Michelle's practiced hands. Pedro's breath caught for a moment. "You both look—" he started, then stopped, trying to find the right word. "Remarkable." Josie beamed. Genesis gave a small nod. "We know how to play our parts, Mr. Whitaker. Just remember, this is temporary." Her words struck deeper than he expected. There was steel in her voice, but something else too. Fear. A wall built high and reinforced over time. "I understand," Pedro said softly. The rest of the day passed quietly. Pedro ordered in dinner, low-country shrimp and grits, which Josie devoured. Genesis ate slowly, methodically, always keeping her eyes on Josie, as if she might disappear if not watched closely. After dinner, they settled into the media room. Josie curled up under a throw blanket, watching an old animated film Pedro couldn't name. Genesis sat beside her but didn't watch. She stared at the screen like it was just another noise to block out. Pedro excused himself and stepped onto the balcony. The night air was cool, salty. The harbor lights blinked in the distance. He leaned on the railing, hands tight around the iron. What was he doing? He didn't know these girls. He wasn't a father. He wasn't even sure he believed in the idea of family anymore. He'd built his life on control, on measured moves, on cold real estate deals. But this was something else. He heard the soft shuffle of feet behind him. "Can't sleep?" he asked without turning. Genesis stepped out, wrapped in a blanket like a cloak. "I wanted to see the stars." Pedro moved slightly to the side, giving her space. "They don't look the same here," she said. "Too much city." He nodded. "You used to live outside the city?" A pause. "Sort of." She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you ever miss someone you shouldn't?" Pedro turned toward her slowly. "Every day." Genesis nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Josie still asks about Mom sometimes," she said. "I don't know what to tell her." "You tell her what you remember," Pedro said gently. "The good parts." "And the bad? You hold those quietly until they stop hurting as much." Genesis looked up at him, studying his face. "You don't talk like other grown-ups." Pedro managed a tired smile. "That's probably for the best." She gave the smallest laugh. Then, without warning, her voice dropped lower. "If anyone comes asking about us, you didn't find us. We found you." Pedro met her eyes. There it was again, that flicker of something buried. Not fear, something worse. Pain, sharpened into vigilance. "I understand," he said. She nodded once and turned to go back inside. Before stepping through the door, she paused. "Thank you for letting us stay." Pedro stood alone for a long time after she left, the wind tugging at his sleeves. This wasn't about the wedding anymore. Not really. Something had started. Something he couldn't walk away from. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to. Pedro stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his cufflinks for the third time. Not because they needed it, but because it gave his hands something to do. His reflection stared back with composed indifference. But beneath that carefully pressed shirt and tailored jacket, something churned. He hadn't worn this suit in over a year. Dark charcoal, subtle silk lining, custom made in Milan, selected by Gianna herself. A detail he hated himself for remembering. From the guest suite, he heard faint voices. Josie humming, Genesis giving directions with that quiet command she always carried. It was Saturday. The wedding was today. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. Sutton Graves. "You sure about this?" Pedro picked up the phone, stared at the message, and typed back, "I'm not sure about anything, but I'm going." He set the phone down and exhaled slowly. The girls emerged not long after. Josie skipped out first, her navy dress fluttering like petals around her legs. Her hair was curled in soft spirals, a simple ribbon holding it back. She beamed up at him. "Do I look like someone you'd bring to a fancy wedding?" she asked. Pedro smiled. "You look better than anyone there will." Genesis followed, her emerald dress sleek and understated. Her hair was swept back in an elegant twist, minimal and mature. She carried herself like she'd done this before, like she didn't need to be told how to move in that world. "You both clean up dangerously well," Pedro said. Josie giggled and twirled again, but Genesis only gave a slight nod. "We remember how," she said, and something in her voice caught his attention. A weight beneath the polish. The car arrived a few minutes later, a black sedan, discreet, windows tinted. Pedro helped Josie into the back seat, then slid in beside Genesis. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, gaze fixed out the window. As they rolled past the historic homes of downtown Charleston, Pedro broke the silence. "Are you nervous?" "A little," Josie answered, looking up at the chandelier earrings Genesis had let her borrow. Genesis didn't answer. Pedro glanced at her. "You don't have to go through with this if you've changed your mind." She turned to him, eyes sharp but calm. "We made a deal. One weekend, one event, then you help us." "And I will." Genesis looked away again, and for the first time Pedro wondered if she was afraid not of the wedding, but of what came after. The estate was nestled just past the marsh, surrounded by magnolia trees and pristine hedges. White tents billowed in the soft wind, and strings of lights flickered even in the daylight. It was the kind of event Charleston society waited for, the merging of two influential names, Gianna Bellamy and Matthias Sterling. Pedro stepped out of the car, offering his hand to Josie, who took it with an excited bounce. Genesis emerged after, composed and watchful. As they approached the entrance, conversations tapered off. Heads turned, a few guests whispered. Others stared openly. Pedro felt the heat of it on his skin, the judgment, the curiosity. He kept his shoulders straight. Inside the reception courtyard, a string quartet played something vaguely familiar. Waiters floated past with trays of champagne. Laughter rang out beneath the drone of southern drawls and designer perfumes. Then he saw her. Gianna. She stood near the fountain in a soft blush gown, her blonde hair pinned into a classic chignon, pearls at her throat. She was talking to a couple, laughing, until her eyes landed on Pedro. The smile faltered. The laugh died mid-note. Her eyes scanned him, then moved to the girls beside him. Genesis gave a small, graceful nod. "Miss Bellamy, your venue is beautiful." Josie added with wide eyes, "Are those real roses?" "My mommy used to love roses." Gianna took a step forward, forcing a smile. "How charming. Pedro, I didn't expect you to come." "You invited me," Pedro replied evenly. "Yes, but I assumed you'd, well, decline." "And miss your big day?" he said. "Never." Her gaze flicked back to Genesis and Josie. "And who are these lovely girls?" Before he could answer, Genesis stepped in. "We're Pedro's nieces. Our parents are abroad. We're visiting for the month." Gianna's eyes narrowed just slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Of course. How delightful." Matthias appeared behind her then, tall and composed, his hand resting on Gianna's back. He studied Pedro with a bland smile. "Whitaker, good of you to show." Pedro extended a hand. "Matthias, congratulations." Matthias shook it, but his eyes were on the girls. "And these are?" "Family," Pedro said simply. A long beat of silence. Then Josie pointed to the string quartet. "They're playing Vivaldi. My mom used to play that on piano." Gianna's eyes twitched. She caught it and tried to smile. "How cultured." Genesis rested a light hand on Josie's shoulder. "We should go find our seats." Gianna didn't move. "Pedro," she said, voice dropping just enough for only him to hear. "You've made your point. Whatever this is, it's beneath you." Pedro met her eyes, voice soft and measured. "Is it?" She didn't answer, just turned, smiling for a new guest arriving. Her social mask snapped back in place like a well-worn glove. Pedro escorted the girls to their assigned table near the front. The tablecloth was ivory lace, the silverware glinting under chandeliers suspended from the tent poles. Josie whispered, "It's like being inside a snow globe." Genesis said nothing. "Are you okay?" Pedro asked her quietly. She nodded once. "I just don't like people staring." He looked around. Eyes were still on them. He could hear the murmurs. "Who are they?" "Since when does Pedro have nieces?" "I heard they're adopted." Pedro leaned closer to Genesis. "You don't owe anyone here anything. Least of all her." Genesis gave a tight nod but didn't speak. The music shifted. A new piece began. The ceremony would start soon. Pedro excused himself to speak with Sutton, who had arrived late and was lingering near the bar. As he walked away, he caught a glimpse of Gianna watching him from across the courtyard, her expression unreadable, her champagne untouched. When he returned to the table, Genesis looked up at him. "She doesn't love him," she said quietly. Pedro froze. "Gianna," Genesis continued. "She looks at him like he's a mirror, not a person, like she's checking to see how she looks, not how he feels." He stared at her. "And she keeps looking over here," she added. Josie popped a grape into her mouth. "She's mad, grown-up mad." Pedro exhaled slowly. The ceremony began shortly after. Gianna walked down the aisle to polite gasps. She looked perfect. But when she reached Matthias at the altar, her smile strained. Pedro felt no triumph, only silence. As the vows echoed through the air, he glanced at Genesis. She was watching Josie. Always watching. Guarded, protective. Her hands folded tightly in her lap. In that moment, Pedro realized something that stole the breath from his lungs. He wasn't playing a part anymore. And neither were they. The reception was in full swing by the time Pedro guided Genesis and Josie into the grand ballroom. Strings of soft golden lights hung from the arched ceiling, casting a warm glow across the space. Tables shimmered with crystal and silver. Servers glided between guests like choreographed dancers. But Pedro felt the temperature drop as soon as they walked in. Eyes followed them. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Laughter faded to murmurs. There was no scene, no shouting, no scandal, but the quiet was almost louder than applause. He felt it settle over him like humidity in the Charleston air. Judgment wrapped in silk and smiles. Josie, oblivious to the tension, clutched his hand tighter and whispered, "Can we look at the cake later? It has real flowers on it." Pedro smiled at her and nodded. "We'll find it after dinner." Genesis walked beside them, her chin slightly lifted, her steps calm and deliberate. She didn't flinch beneath the stares. If anything, she seemed to walk straighter because of them. Pedro felt something twist in his chest. Pride, maybe. Or guilt. They reached their table, which was closer to the front than he expected. Gianna's doing, he was sure. A spotlight masquerading as hospitality. As they settled in, a familiar voice called out across the room, "Pedro Whitaker, as I live and breathe." He turned to find Gregory Masters striding toward him, a longtime acquaintance and one of Gianna's family friends, a banker, wealthy, old Charleston blood, charming in public, calculating in private. Pedro stood to shake his hand. "Didn't expect to see you here," Gregory said with a glint of amusement. "And certainly not with such lovely company." If you enjoyed this video, comment 1 to let me know. If not, comment 2. Your thoughts matter to me either way. Before Pedro could answer, Genesis stood and offered her hand with poise. "I'm Genesis. This is my sister, Josie." Gregory took her hand, eyes narrowing slightly. "You've got excellent manners, young lady." "She was raised well," Pedro said, his voice steady. Gregory's gaze lingered a moment longer, then shifted to Josie, who was now admiring the floral centerpiece. "You know," Gregory said, lowering his voice, "she reminds me of someone. Can't put my finger on it." Pedro didn't respond. Gregory smiled and clapped him on the shoulder. "Good to see you, Whitaker. It's nice you've got some family around you." As he walked away, Pedro exhaled slowly and sat back down. Genesis leaned in. "He knows something." "Maybe," Pedro replied, "but he's not sure what." Dinner was served in courses, each one more elaborate than the last. Josie lit up at the mention of truffle mashed potatoes, while Genesis silently rearranged her silverware with precise movements. Pedro noticed something then. The way Genesis instinctively reached for the correct fork, how she folded her napkin neatly in her lap, How she thanked the server with a tone that wasn't rehearsed. It was inherited. This wasn't learned in shelters. This was learned at tables like this one. He leaned closer. Genesis, where did you learn all this? She didn't look at him. We've been to places like this before. Before what? Her hand tightened around her water glass. Before everything changed. Josie interrupted, her voice bright. Can we go see the music after dessert? I like the songs. Pedro nodded. Of course. As dessert was served, a delicate lemon soufflé with sugared violets, Gianna made her way toward their table. Pedro noticed her approach before the girls did. She was smiling, but it didn't reach her eyes. Pedro, she said smoothly, I wanted to personally thank you for coming. It means a lot. He stood, polite but not warm. You invited me. And I meant it. Her gaze drifted to the girls. Your nieces are quite the charmers. Genesis stood again, always a step ahead. Miss Bellamy, congratulations on your wedding. It was lovely. Gianna gave a small nod, then looked at Pedro. Can I borrow you for a moment? Just a quick word. He glanced at the girls, then followed her a few steps away from the table, far enough for privacy, but still in view. You've made your statement, she said quietly. Point taken. But I have to ask, who are they really? They're with me, Pedro said simply. Gianna's voice lowered. You brought children to my wedding, Pedro. You think I don't know what that looks like? You think people aren't already whispering that you're trying to send a message? I didn't come here to play games, he said. Then why are you here with two girls no one's ever seen before, pretending they're family? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he met her eyes. Why does it matter to you? Gianna faltered. Because you don't do things like this. You're measured, controlled. So what changed? Pedro's voice dropped. You did. She blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me? You walked away because you didn't want a life without children. And now I've met two who needed someone. I didn't plan it. I didn't orchestrate it. But they're here. And so am I. Gianna crossed her arms. They're not your nieces. Pedro tilted his head. What makes you so sure? Because you don't have a brother or a sister. He smiled faintly. Maybe I adopted. She stepped closer. You're not a father, Pedro. You're a man who builds luxury hotels and hides his heart in spreadsheets. This question mark, this isn't you. He looked past her to where Genesis was carefully helping Josie with her napkin. You're right, he said softly. It wasn't. And with that, he walked away. Back at the table, Josie stood up and grabbed his hand. Can we see the music now? Please? He smiled and nodded. Let's go. They walked to the edge of the dance floor where a small string quartet played near the dais. Josie watched in awe as the musicians moved in harmony. They're playing the same song Mom used to play, she whispered. Genesis joined them a moment later. It's called Clair de Lune. Pedro looked at her. You knew that? She nodded. Mom was a pianist. We used to watch her at recitals. There was a pause, a beat too long. Then Pedro said gently, What happened to her? Genesis didn't answer, but Josie, without hesitation, whispered, She died. In the accident. Pedro's breath caught. What kind of accident? Genesis stepped between them. Later, Josie. The moment stretched. Then Josie looked up at Pedro. Can we go home soon? He nodded. Yes, very soon. They left quietly, slipping out before the cake was cut, before the toasts were raised, before anyone else could question who they were or why they came. Back in the car, Josie leaned her head against Genesis's shoulder and whispered, I like him. Genesis didn't answer right away. But then, in a voice just above a whisper, she said, I think I do too. Pedro sat in silence beside them, watching the streetlights pass. He didn't say anything, but something in his chest had shifted. This wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about becoming someone new. The rain started just as the car pulled into the underground garage of Pedro's building. Not a hard downpour, just a gentle, steady rhythm that seemed to settle the city into stillness. The kind of rain that made Charleston's cobblestone streets glisten like oil paintings and turned the skyline into a blur of soft reflections. Josie was already half asleep against Genesis's shoulder. Her head lolled gently with the motion of the car, the stuffed rabbit still clutched in her hand. Pedro looked over from the driver's seat. She didn't even make it home. She hasn't slept properly in days, Genesis said quietly, brushing a loose curl from her sister's cheek. Neither have I, if I'm being honest. Pedro put the car in park and turned off the engine. For a moment they just sat in the silence, surrounded by the muted thrum of rain above them. "You were incredible tonight," he said. "Both of you." Genesis didn't reply right away. She stared out the window, watching droplets race each other down the glass. "I didn't expect to feel anything, but I did." Pedro glanced over. "What kind of anything?" "I don't know," she said. "Like we were supposed to be there. Like we belonged. And then, like we didn't." Pedro didn't answer. He understood that feeling too well. He got out and opened the back door, gently lifting Josie into his arms. She stirred but didn't wake, curling instinctively against his chest. Her warmth, the tiny weight of her body, it all felt strange and necessary at once. Genesis followed silently, her footsteps soft against the polished floors of the garage. Upstairs, the penthouse was warm, filled with the faint scent of lavender from the diffusers his assistant always kept stocked. Pedro laid Josie down on the guest bed, pulling a quilt over her small frame. She sighed in her sleep, a peaceful sound that somehow made the silence feel fuller. In the hallway, Genesis leaned against the wall, arms crossed. She looked older than she had at the wedding, as if the evening had drained something from her. Pedro stepped out quietly and closed the door behind him. "You hungry?" Genesis shook her head. He hesitated. "Come sit for a bit." She followed him into the kitchen, where he poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and slid one across the counter toward her. She took it but didn't drink. "You've done this before," he said. Genesis looked at him, brows raised. "Done what?" "Worn dresses like that, stood in ballrooms, smiled through conversations you didn't believe in." Her eyes flickered, but she didn't deny it. Pedro leaned against the counter. "You said your mother played piano?" Genesis looked down at her glass. "She taught lessons at home, mostly to rich kids who didn't want to practice. She sounds like someone who loved music." "She did," Genesis said softly. "She played when she was sad, and when she was happy. Same pieces, different meanings." Pedro watched her closely. "What about your father?" There was a pause. "He was in finance," she said finally. "Gone a lot, always working. But he loved us. He was tired." The way she said it left little room for questions, but it was enough. "And then one day," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "they were both gone, and everything after that felt like something we weren't meant to survive." Pedro let the silence stretch. "You don't have to explain anything you're not ready to," he said gently. "I know," she said, setting the glass down, "but someone should know." She looked at him fully now, her eyes sharp again. "You're not like them." Pedro blinked. "Like who?" "The people at that wedding, polite on the surface but always watching for a crack, always calculating. You watched for something else tonight. I saw it." "What did I watch for?" "Us," she said. "You kept checking to see if we were okay. Not if we were impressive, not if we were useful." He felt the words hit somewhere he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. "I didn't expect you to trust me," he said. "I didn't expect to either," she replied. Pedro let out a breath, then looked toward the hallway. "You've both been through a lot." "We're still going through it," she said. "But Josie, she needs a little light right now. She needs someone who doesn't make her feel like a burden." "And you?" "I need to make sure she gets it." Pedro nodded slowly. Then she said something he wasn't ready for. "If something happens to me, promise me you'll look after her." He straightened. "Nothing's going to happen to you." "Just promise," Genesis said. Her voice didn't crack, but her hands curled into fists on the counter. Pedro stepped closer, his voice steady. "You both walked into my life without warning. I didn't ask for this, but I'm not walking away. Not now." She looked up at him, and for the first time her eyes shimmered with something close to tears, but they didn't fall. "I'm not good at letting people help." "I'm not good at asking," he replied. A breathless laugh escaped her, almost like she hadn't meant for it to. He gave a small smile. "Go get some rest. You earned it." She nodded and turned toward the guest room, but just before she reached the door she paused. "Pedro?" "Yeah?" "I've never met anyone like you." He didn't speak, just nodded once. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Pedro stood alone in the kitchen, the clock ticking quietly above the stovetop. His phone buzzed on the counter. A new text. From Gianna. "You'll regret dragging them into this." He stared at it for a long time. Then, without replying, he turned the phone over, screen side down, and walked away. Pedro didn't sleep. Not because he couldn't, but because something in the air had shifted, and his instincts refused to let him rest. He sat on the balcony just past midnight, the rain now a memory, the air thick with southern humidity, and the scent of damp jasmine from the vines curling around the railing. The lights of Charleston sparkled below, elegant and distant. He sipped a glass of bourbon slowly, letting the silence do the talking. Genesis's words replayed in his head. "If something happens to me, promise me you'll look after her." What kind of life led an 11-year-old to say something like that? He heard the faint creak of the guest room door opening. Light footsteps padded down the hall. Not Josie. Too light. Genesis. Pedro didn't turn when she stepped onto the balcony. She didn't say anything at first, just sat down in the chair beside him, legs tucked up beneath her. "I couldn't sleep," she said finally. "I didn't expect you to," Pedro replied. They sat for a moment in silence. Then she said, "Did you mean it? What you said earlier, about not walking away?" Pedro turned his head. "Every word." Genesis stared out into the night, arms wrapped around her knees. "People always say things like that, right before they disappear. I'm not people." She gave a small, disbelieving smile. "That's what makes you dangerous." Pedro studied her, the way her jaw tightened when she was holding something in. "What aren't you telling me?" Her voice was quiet. "The people who are looking for us, they're not good. They don't care about us. Not really. They care about what comes with us." He leaned forward slightly. "What comes with you?" Genesis hesitated. Then she said, "Our last name, our trust, our silence." Pedro's brows knit together. "Your trust?" "My grandparents were wealthy, old Charleston money. My parents didn't want that life. They moved us away from it. But when they died..." She trailed off. "There was supposed to be an inheritance. Conditions. Control. Are you saying someone's trying to get custody for access to it?" She nodded once. "Our grandmother, Sylvia. She's connected, respected. She plays piano in churches and donates to charities, but behind closed doors, she's cold, strategic. She wanted us raised properly, but she didn't want us. Just the name." Pedro let that sink in. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Genesis looked at him, suddenly defensive. Because everyone we've ever trusted either turned away or turned on us. You're just a man who opened a door. Pedro held her gaze. And you walked through it. That counts. A soft sound interrupted them. Josie stood in the doorway, rubbing her eyes, the stuffed rabbit hanging by one ear in her hand. Are you mad at each other? She asked sleepily. Genesis stood immediately. No, baby, we're just talking. Josie patted over and climbed into her sister's lap, curling into her without hesitation. I dreamed we lived in a house with trees, and you played the piano, and there were muffins. Pedro smiled. That sounds like a good dream. It was. You were there too, she added, blinking at him. But you looked sad. Genesis kissed the top of Josie's head. It was just a dream. Pedro's voice dropped. Maybe it's a memory waiting to happen. Later that morning, after the girls had gone back to bed, Pedro sat in his office scrolling through old property records, local trust registries, and anything connected to the Brighton name. What Genesis said kept ringing in his head like a bell refusing to go silent. He pulled out his phone and called Sutton. I need a favor, he said. Sutton yawned. It's not even 7. I need you to look into someone. Sylvia Brighton. There was a pause. That's a name I haven't heard in years. So you do know her. Pedro, everyone in Old Charleston knows Sylvia. She practically owns half the historic district. Why are you asking? Pedro hesitated. She may be trying to reclaim custody of Genesis and Josie. A longer pause. That woman doesn't move unless there's money attached. My thoughts exactly. Sutton's voice dropped. What did the girls tell you? Enough. But I need to know the rest. I'll make some calls, Sutton said. Quiet ones. Thank you. Pedro hung up and stared at the window. The city was starting to wake, but inside him something was turning over, an edge of suspicion layered with instinct. Sylvia wasn't just an estranged grandmother, she was a player. And if Genesis and Josie were the pieces, Pedro had just placed himself on the board. By afternoon, the girls were back to their quiet routines. Josie drawing at the kitchen counter, Genesis reading a book far too advanced for her age. Pedro stood nearby, taking in the domestic calm of it all. It felt borrowed, fragile. His phone buzzed. Sutton. He stepped into the hallway before answering. I spoke to a friend at the courthouse, Sutton said. Turns out Sylvia Brighton filed an inquiry about legal guardianship last year. It was denied. Temporary placement had already gone to someone else. But that person never followed through. The file was left open. Pedro frowned. She's waiting for the right moment. She's watching, biding her time. Pedro rubbed his forehead. Can she take them? If she proves you have no legal claim and convinces a judge that she's the most appropriate family member? Yes. Pedro's voice hardened. Not going to happen. I didn't think you'd say anything else, Sutton replied. I'll keep digging. Pedro hung up, the tension in his jaw building. He turned back to the living room. Josie had fallen asleep on the couch again, pencil still in hand. Genesis looked up from her book, sensing the shift. What is it? Pedro looked her straight in the eye. Your grandmother might be coming. Genesis didn't blink. Then we'll be ready. No, Pedro said, I'll be ready. And for the first time, Genesis didn't argue, she just nodded. Something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't about protection anymore. It was about belonging. Pedro stood in front of his bathroom mirror the next morning, razor still in his hand, foam half smeared along his jawline. But his reflection wasn't cooperating. He wasn't seeing his face. He was seeing Sylvia Brighton's name typed in bold at the top of the court inquiry Sutton had sent to his private email overnight. It was dated 10 months ago. 10 months. She'd waited almost a full year without making a move, calculated, patient, waiting for the right moment to strike. Pedro wiped his face clean and pulled on a fresh button-down shirt. Down the hallway, the soft hum of life had already begun. Josie humming to herself while pouring cereal, Genesis opening and closing cabinet doors, silent but present. He found them in the kitchen, sunlight flooding the marble countertops. "Good morning," he said, keeping his voice calm. Josie smiled up at him. "Morning? I made mine myself. No spilling this time." Genesis looked over her shoulder, her eyes scanning his expression. "You didn't sleep much." Pedro poured himself a coffee. Neither did the city. She sat at the island beside Josie, fingers wrapped around her own mug. "What did you find out?" Pedro met her gaze. "Your grandmother tried to take guardianship months ago. The system stalled her, but she's still watching, still waiting." Genesis didn't react right away. Then she asked, "Does she know we're here?" Pedro hesitated. "If she didn't before the wedding, she does now." Silence. Josie looked up between them, her spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "Are we in trouble?" Pedro crouched beside her, brushing a hand gently over her curls. "No, sweetheart. Not as long as I'm here." Genesis said nothing, but Pedro saw it, the faintest twitch in her jaw. The fear wasn't for herself. It never had been. It was for her sister. Later that afternoon, while Josie napped curled into a blanket on the sunroom sofa, Pedro and Genesis sat across from each other in the living room. He held a stack of documents Sutton had pulled. Old trust files, probate paperwork, clipped newspaper articles from when the Brighton estate went quiet after the accident. "Your parents' estate," Pedro said, tapping the top document. "There was a trust held in both your names. It's substantial. But it's locked until one of you turns 18, unless a legal guardian is appointed." Genesis leaned forward. "And if that guardian is Sylvia, she gets control, at least partial access to manage it on your behalf." "She never loved my mom," Genesis said flatly. "She called her soft, said artists didn't belong in business families." "She ever say that to you?" "No," she replied. "She said it to my father, while I was in the hallway. She didn't think I could hear." Pedro nodded slowly. "She wants the Brighton legacy back under her roof." "She can keep the name," Genesis muttered. "She just can't have us." Pedro reached for his phone. "We need legal representation, now." Genesis watched him dial. "Who?" she asked. Pedro glanced up. "Someone who doesn't care about reputation, only results." The phone rang once. Then a voice answered. "Nadine Holt." Pedro straightened. "Judge Holt, it's Pedro Whitaker." "Well, I'll be. Calling me on a Sunday? I assume this isn't about brunch?" Pedro smiled faintly. "I need help. Not in court. Yet. Just direction." There was a pause. "Is this about those two girls you paraded through Gianna Bellamy's wedding?" Pedro didn't flinch. "Yes." Another pause. "Come by my house this evening. Bring paperwork, and bring the truth." Pedro hung up and looked at Genesis. "We're going to see a judge." She raised an eyebrow. "Now?" "Now." That evening they drove to a quiet neighborhood outside the city, where oaks arched across narrow streets and front porches still had rockers that creaked in the wind. Judge Nadine Holt lived in a modest colonial with white shutters and a yard of blooming azaleas. She opened the door herself. Pedro had expected someone stern, towering. But Nadine Holt was small. Steel gray hair pulled back, eyes that saw straight through pretenses. She looked at Genesis first. "You must be the older one." "Yes, ma'am." "You've got your mother's posture. Come in." The living room was filled with books and soft lighting, the air smelling faintly of lemon and rosemary. Nadine pointed them to the couch, then took an armchair across from them. Pedro handed her the documents. She scanned them quickly, her fingers tracing margins with practiced ease. Then she looked up. "You don't have custody?" "No," Pedro admitted. "They came to me. I didn't plan it. But you brought them to a public wedding. You understand how that looks?" "I do," he said. "But I won't let them go back to someone who sees them as a tool." Nadine turned to Genesis. "Do you want to be here, child?" Genesis didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Why?" "Because this is the first place Josie slept through the night in months. Because no one makes me feel like a secret here." The judge studied her. "And you trust him?" Genesis looked at Pedro, then back at her. "He doesn't pretend. That's rare." Nadine leaned back. "Well, I can't grant you custody in a living room, but I can start the process, and I can place a protective hold on their file. It'll buy you time." Pedro exhaled. "Thank you." "But Pedro," she added, her voice low, "if you do this, it's not a gesture. It's a commitment. You'll be tested. You'll be watched. And if Sylvia moves first, this could get very public." "I'm ready," he said. She smiled faintly. "We'll see." Back at the penthouse, it was dark when they returned. Josie was asleep again on the couch, a book clutched in her hand. Genesis pulled a blanket over her. "Do you think she'll come soon?" she asked Pedro quietly. "Yes," he said, "but we'll be ready." Genesis looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "You know what scares me the most?" "What?" "That Josie will believe Sylvia if she tells her we were never wanted." Pedro's chest tightened. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and took Genesis's hand, steady and warm. And for once, she didn't pull away. It was the kind of morning Charleston did best, quiet, blue-skied, with just enough breeze to stir the wisteria on Pedro's balcony. But the stillness felt deceptive, like a held breath. Pedro stood at the stove flipping cinnamon pancakes, Josie's latest obsession, while Genesis poured orange juice with the precision of a girl who could never afford to spill anything. The air between them was easy, lighter than it had been in days. "You're domestic," Genesis noted, folding her arms with a smirk. Pedro glanced at her over his shoulder. "Don't sound so surprised." "I just didn't expect a millionaire to know how to make pancakes that don't come from a box." "I own a boutique hotel chain," he replied. "Good food is a survival skill." Josie appeared from the hallway, hair tousled, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. "Something smells happy," she announced, climbing into her seat at the island. "It's Cinnamon Day," Pedro said. She beamed. "The best kind." They ate together, slow, unrushed. Genesis actually smiled more than once. Josie told a story about a squirrel she'd once seen steal a sandwich from a stroller, and Pedro laughed harder than he had in weeks. But the mood shifted when his phone buzzed across the countertop. One glance at the screen, and the warmth in Pedro's chest turned cold. "Unknown number, Mr. Whitaker. We need to talk about Genesis and Josie Brighton. SB." He didn't say anything, just set the phone down, screen side up. Genesis caught the initials instantly. Her face went still. She reached out. Pedro gave a small nod. "Just now." "What does she want?" "She says she wants to talk." Genesis leaned back in her chair, arms folded. "She doesn't want a conversation. She wants control." Josie looked up. "Who's SB?" Genesis hesitated. Pedro spoke gently. "Someone from your family, Josie." "Are they nice?" Genesis's eyes darkened. "Not really." Josie went quiet, stirring the last bite of pancake and syrup that was starting to go cold. Pedro stood. She's playing her hand, which means she's close, and she's watching. Genesis's voice dropped. She always watches. Pedro turned to her. Then it's time we watch her back. Later that afternoon, Sutton arrived with a manila folder tucked under his arm and an expression that said he didn't like what he was about to share. They sat in Pedro's office, the girls in the other room watching an old animated film on low volume. "She's moving fast," Sutton said. "I pulled filings from the courthouse. Sylvia Brighton petitioned for emergency custody this morning." Pedro's stomach turned. "On what grounds?" "She's citing abandonment and claiming you're interfering with the girl's legal welfare." Pedro's jaw tightened. "That's rich, coming from someone who let them disappear for almost a year." "She's also hired counsel." "Who?" Sutton opened the folder and laid a glossy headshot on the desk. "Valerie Heath." Pedro's shoulders stiffened. "She's one of the best. Also one of the coldest, and very well connected." Genesis appeared in the doorway without knocking. "You said her name." The lawyer, Pedro, looked up. "You know her?" Genesis nodded slowly. "She came to the group home once, asked a lot of questions, but she wasn't warm. She didn't ask about us, just about where we'd been. She didn't even look at Josie." Sutton leaned back. "She's not here for children. She's here for legacy." Pedro closed the folder. "Then we need to be 10 steps ahead." Genesis walked further into the room, arms crossed. "What happens if she wins?" Pedro didn't flinch. "She won't." Genesis stared at him. "You don't know that." "I don't need to know," Pedro said. "I just need to fight like I do." There was a long silence between them. Then Genesis said quietly, "What if they try to twist our story?" "They will," Sutton said. "It's what people like Sylvia and Valerie do. But truth has weight, and the two of you are stronger than they think." Pedro stood. "We need evidence. Anything that shows Sylvia's motive. Anything that shows the girls were safer away from her." "I know someone," Genesis said. "She used to work for my parents, a tutor, Ms. Ray. She left just before everything fell apart. I don't know where she went, but she knew things." Pedro nodded. "Can you describe her? Full name?" "Her name was June Ray. She had a cat named Lincoln and drank tea out of a mason jar even when my mom offered real china." Sutton smiled. "That's specific. I'll find her." Pedro turned to Genesis. "If we can get her statement, it might shift everything." Genesis hesitated, then asked, "Do you really believe we can beat her?" "I don't just believe it," Pedro said. "I'm counting on it." That night the air was thick with coming rain, thunder low in the distance. Josie was asleep again, her breathing soft and even, cheeks flushed from too much laughter and not enough sleep. Pedro stood in the doorway of her room, watching. Genesis joined him without a word. "She never looked this peaceful when we were moving around," she whispered. "She used to sleep in fits, like she was afraid to rest." Pedro didn't look at Genesis when he asked, "What changed?" "You did." He turned to her slowly. Genesis shrugged, eyes still fixed on her sister. "You made her feel safe. That's not easy. She's small, but she feels everything." Pedro's voice was low. "And you?" She met his gaze. "I'm still figuring it out." A soft silence settled between them. Then Genesis whispered, "If she takes us, don't let Josie forget this. Don't let her forget you." Pedro stepped closer, his voice nearly a vow. "She won't have to." They stood in the doorway until the thunder passed, watching over a child who finally knew what home was, even if it might be taken from her. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m., but by 9:30, reporters were already swarming the Charleston City Hall steps like bees circling a hive. Cameras snapped, microphones were tested, voices buzzed with the kind of anticipation that only came when someone powerful was about to spin a very public story. Pedro stood across the street in the lobby of the courthouse annex, staring out the window, one hand in his pocket, the other gently resting on Josie's shoulder. Genesis stood beside them, still and unreadable, her hair pulled back in a tight braid that made her look older than she was. "This isn't going to be easy," Pedro said quietly. "People are going to say things, some true, some not." Genesis nodded once. "We've heard worse." Josie looked up at him. "Are there going to be cameras?" "Yes." "Do I have to talk?" "Only if you want to." She thought for a second. "Then I want to." Pedro turned, crouching so he could meet her at eye level. "You sure?" She gave the smallest nod. "If people are going to say stuff, I want to say mine first." Across the street, flashes began going off. A sleek black car pulled up. From it emerged Sylvia Brighton, elegant in a cream coat with pearl earrings and perfectly waved silver hair. She didn't rush. She never did. Every step was measured, her posture regal, her presence deliberate. Behind her, Valerie Heath stepped out. Tall, poised, in a slate gray skirt suit, her expression like polished stone. She surveyed the crowd, then lifted her chin. Pedro felt Genesis stiffen beside him. "That's her," she said. "The one who never asked how we were doing, just where we'd been." He touched her arm. "Let's go." The walk across the street felt longer than it should have. The buzz of cameras intensified the moment they were spotted. A ripple spread across the press like wind across tall grass. Pedro didn't flinch. Neither did the girls. A reporter called out, "Mr. Whitaker, care to comment on the custody petition?" He didn't answer. Another one. "Is it true you took the girls to the Bellamy-Sterling wedding to provoke Gianna Bellamy?" He paused just long enough to say, "No comment," then guided the girls through the crowd with a calm authority that silenced the rest. They stood near the side entrance, waiting as Sylvia stepped to the podium. Her smile was gentle, warm. The performance began. "I want to thank you all for being here," she said, her voice perfectly modulated. "I've remained quiet for some time, but I believe the public deserves to understand the truth. My granddaughters Genesis and Josie have been missing from my life for far too long. I've prayed for their safety. I've trusted in the system. And now I'm here to restore what was broken." The reporters leaned in. Flashbulbs flared. Sylvia continued, "Their parents, my beloved daughter and son-in-law, died tragically. Their estate left many things unresolved. My only desire is to ensure these girls are raised with dignity, education, and the love of their blood family." Pedro felt something in him flare, but before he could step forward, Genesis moved. "Let me," she said, her voice low. Pedro blinked. "Genesis, I want them to hear it." Josie reached for her sister's hand. "We do it together?" Genesis looked down at her, and her expression cracked, just slightly. Then she nodded. "Together." They stepped toward the front of the crowd. The cameras shifted. Reporters scrambled. Pedro followed, staying close but not interfering. Genesis's voice rang out, steady and clear. "She's not telling you the truth." Silence fell. Sylvia's smile faltered. Genesis took another step forward. "My grandmother didn't want us until we came with a check. She said artists don't raise proper girls. She said our mother was soft, and she said our father was a mistake." A gasp from somewhere in the crowd. Josie stepped up beside her sister, gripping her hand tightly. "She told us if we didn't stop asking about Mommy, she'd send us to different houses." "She didn't comfort us," Genesis added. "She corrected us." A heavy pause. Pedro stepped up now, his voice low but steady. "I didn't come looking for these girls. They found me. They showed up when I least expected them. I didn't plan to keep them. I didn't even know how. But I knew they deserved more than a memory and a court file." The cameras kept flashing. Reporters were frozen, as if trying to process whether this moment was real or theater. Pedro looked at Sylvia directly. "You abandoned them when they needed you. Don't dress that up with words like legacy and dignity. Sylvia didn't respond. Her eyes narrowed, barely, but her grip on the podium tightened. Valerie stepped forward, ready to speak. But before she could, Judge Holt appeared at the edge of the crowd, her gray coat buttoned up, her gaze cutting through the commotion like a knife through fog. She raised a hand. Enough. The crowd fell silent. I've seen enough for today. There will be no further comments. The court will issue a statement after proper review. Sylvia turned, her composure cracking ever so slightly. Valerie whispered something in her ear. They walked off without another word. Pedro turned back to the girls. Genesis looked drained. Josie leaned against his side. You okay? He asked. Genesis nodded slowly. I said it out loud. That matters. It does, Pedro said, and you said it better than I ever could. He looked around at the sea of faces and cameras, all still trained on them, and in that moment he realized something. This wasn't a performance. This was their story now, and it was just beginning. The ocean stretched wide and endless beyond the porch, soft waves brushing the sand in a rhythm that had no urgency. Pedro leaned on the railing of his Sullivan's Island cottage, mug in hand, watching the early morning mist roll across the dunes like breath from a sleeping giant. It had been 3 days since the press conference. 3 days of quiet headlines, subtle calls from investors, and too many voicemails from people pretending to care. 3 days of silence from Sylvia's team, which only made Pedro more suspicious. But here, the girls had peace. He heard the screen door creak behind him. Genesis stepped onto the porch, her hair in a loose braid, barefoot in borrowed linen pajamas that looked too grown up for her frame. She held a notebook against her chest and stared at the ocean as if it held the answer to everything she hadn't said yet. She's still asleep, she said softly, nodding toward the house. Pedro gave a slight smile. Good. She needs it. They stood in silence, just the wind and the tide between them. She cried in her sleep last night, Genesis said, her voice flat but tight. She said Mom's name. Pedro glanced at her. Did you wake her? Number Y just held her hand. Pedro let that sit. Genesis looked out at the water again. This place, it doesn't feel temporary. It's not. She turned to him then. Don't say things you don't mean. I don't. She studied him. You say it like it's that simple. It's not. But it can still be true. She looked away, but he saw the way her jaw clenched. I used to believe people when they said things like that. Then they changed their minds. Pedro set his mug down on the railing. I'm not changing mine. The door creaked again. Josie stepped outside, sleepy-eyed, dragging her rabbit by the ear. You're both up, she mumbled. Is it breakfast time or talking time? Pedro grinned. Both. She padded over, climbed into the porch swing, and curled up like a cat, listening to the ocean. Genesis sat beside her, gently combing her fingers through Josie's curls. Pedro watched them, the quiet intimacy of two people who'd learned to be each other's everything. I need to ask you something, he said after a while. Genesis looked up. If we could find someone who knew your parents, someone who saw what happened when things fell apart, would you talk to them? Her face didn't move, but her eyes darkened. Why? Because stories matter. And if someone else can help tell yours, especially to the court, it could change everything. Genesis hesitated. Ms. Ray. Pedro's heart jumped. The tutor! She knew things, she heard things, and she never lied to us. Do you know where she is? Number she left after the second incident. Said she couldn't stay anymore. She hugged Josie goodbye and cried on the porch. No one else ever cried when they left. Pedro nodded. Sutton's looking. I think he's close. Josie spoke up suddenly, eyes still half shut. She gave me a blue marble, said it was lucky. Pedro smiled gently. Do you still have it? Josie nodded. In the zipper part of my backpack. We're going to find her, Pedro said. I promise. The next day, Sutton called. Pedro answered before the second ring. I found her, Sutton said. June Ray. She's living in Georgia now, teaching piano again part-time. She didn't want to talk until I told her the names. Pedro was already grabbing his keys. Tell me where. They made the drive that afternoon, Pedro, Genesis, and Josie across the state line, through winding rural roads, until they reached a quiet little house shaded by oaks. Wind chimes tinkled on the porch. A small car sat out front, its license plate slightly crooked. June Ray opened the door before they knocked. She looked older than Genesis remembered, softer around the eyes, silver streaks now woven through her dark hair. But her face lit up the moment she saw the girls. Oh, she breathed. Oh, my girls. Josie ran forward first, burying her face in June's side. Genesis hung back, her arms folded, unsure, unsteady. June reached out gently. It's all right, sweetheart. I never stopped wondering. That cracked Genesis's shell. She stepped forward slowly and let June hug her, just for a moment. But it was enough. Inside, the living room smelled like vanilla and old sheet music. A cat with mismatched eyes watched them from the windowsill. Lincoln. Still alive. June poured sweet tea and sat across from them, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a faded photo on the table. Your mother used to sit right there and play Chopin until the light went out, she whispered. She was the gentlest soul. Pedro watched Genesis closely. Her jaw was tight again. She tried, Genesis said. She tried to protect us. She did, June said. And so did your father. But after the accident, after the first court meeting, everything changed. Sylvia became cold, controlling, and you two, you became ghosts in your own home. Pedro leaned forward. Would you testify to that? June looked at him, surprised. Yes, he said. Would you be willing to write a statement? Maybe even appear in court? June nodded slowly. If it means protecting them? I'll speak. I should have spoken sooner. Genesis let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Josie tugged at Pedro's sleeve. Can we come back here again? Pedro looked at June. Would that be all right? June smiled, tears brimming. Anytime. On the drive home, the girls slept curled into each other in the back seat. Pedro kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the center console, heart thudding with a quiet kind of certainty. This wasn't just about defending them anymore. It was about honoring everyone who never got to, and making sure the girls were never forgotten again. Pedro had just finished setting down Josie's plate of warm blueberry waffles when his phone lit up on the kitchen counter. It wasn't the screen that made his stomach tighten. It was the silence that followed. One ring, no buzz, no second attempt. He wiped his hands and stepped closer. Unknown number. Check your email. VH Valerie Heath. Pedro's pulse quickened. He opened the inbox and there it was, an official court notice stamped with urgency. His eyes skimmed it quickly, mouth tightening at each line. Sylvia Brighton had filed an emergency hearing request. Immediate review. Custody challenge. New evidence. Hearing in 48 hours. Genesis stepped into the kitchen doorway just as he lowered the phone. You read it? She said quietly. Pedro nodded. She didn't ask what it said, she didn't have to. I'll call Sutton, he said, already reaching for his phone again. We're not waiting. We go on offense. But Genesis's voice stopped him. You think she found Ms. Ray? I don't know. She's escalating, Genesis said. That means she's scared. Pedro nodded. Good. Sutton arrived within the hour, briefcase in one hand, jacket slung over his shoulder, face hard. He dropped the case on the dining table and opened it like a man unrolling a strategy map. "She wants full custody," he said. "With a restraining order against you, Pedro." "On what grounds?" Pedro asked. "Unlawful harboring, manipulation of minors, claims of media exploitation." Genesis gave a bitter laugh. "Because we told the truth?" "She's building a narrative," Sutton said. "And she's got Valerie doing the talking. That woman can twist sunlight into shade." Pedro ran a hand through his hair. "We need to move now." "We already are." Sutton pulled out a copy of June Ray's statement. "I filed this with the judge this morning. Backed it up with medical reports from Josie's former pediatrician. Delayed wellness checks, unaddressed anxiety. It's enough to challenge Sylvia's claim of being fit." Pedro exhaled. "And Genesis?" Sutton looked at her. "You'll need to speak, in court." Genesis didn't blink. "I'm ready." Sutton hesitated. "There's something else. Sylvia has one last card. She's named a character witness." Pedro's jaw clenched. "Who?" Sutton opened another folder and turned it around. A photo. Sharp, familiar. Gianna. Genesis leaned forward. "She's still involved?" "She's testifying as someone with personal knowledge of Pedro's lifestyle. The angle will be instability, emotional unpredictability, questioning your motives." Pedro's voice dropped. "She's not doing this for Sylvia. She's doing it for herself." "Doesn't matter why," Sutton said. "Only matters how we counter it." Pedro looked toward the hallway, where Josie's laughter echoed faintly from the living room. He turned back. "We take the stand." The courthouse smelled of old paper and worn leather, like stories that had been told 1,000 times, none of them quite the same. The judge presiding over the emergency hearing wasn't Holt, but someone new, Judge Avery. Younger, less familiar. Sylvia sat at the opposite table, flawless in ivory, Valerie at her side, Gianna behind them like a sculpted ghost. Pedro took his place with Sutton. Genesis and Josie sat just behind them, their hands clasped tightly. The judge spoke, voice crisp. "Ms. Brighton, you filed a motion for immediate custody transfer. Present your claim." Valerie stood smoothly. "Your Honor, my client is the maternal grandmother of Genesis and Josie Brighton. Following the tragic loss of their parents, my client attempted legal guardianship, but was denied due to miscommunication and systemic delays. Since that time, the children have been unlawfully withheld by Mr. Whitaker, a man with no biological or legal connection to them." Genesis shifted slightly in her seat. Valerie continued. "We contend that Mr. Whitaker has inserted himself into their lives for personal reasons, exposing them to media scrutiny and using them for social leverage." Pedro stood. "Objection." "Mr. Whitaker," Judge Avery interrupted. "You'll have your turn." Valerie closed her folder. "We request immediate removal of the children from his custody and return to their rightful family home." "Mr. Whitaker," the judge said. "Proceed." Pedro stood slowly. "Your Honor, I didn't go looking for these girls. They came to me, scared, cold, alone. What began as one night became something neither of us planned, because the moment I saw them, I knew I couldn't turn away." He turned toward Genesis and Josie. "They have been safer, happier, and more whole in the last month than they've been in the past year. I'm not asking for gratitude. I'm asking that they not be sent back into silence." Sutton handed a folder to the clerk. Exhibit A, a written statement from June Ray, former tutor and caregiver to the Brighton children. Exhibit B, medical records indicating neglect during Ms. Brighton's previous care. Valerie stood again. "We'd like to call Gianna Bellamy to the stand." Pedro didn't move. Gianna took her seat like she was stepping onto a stage. "Pedro is a complicated man," she began. "He's passionate, intense, and he doesn't always think about the consequences of his actions. Valerie leaned forward. Would you say he's impulsive? Yes, Gianna said, and emotional. And were those the reasons you ended your engagement? Gianna hesitated, and then something shifted. No, she said softly. That's not why. Valerie blinked. Excuse me. Gianna glanced at Pedro. I left because I was afraid, not of him, of what it meant to stay, of choosing something hard and real over something perfect on paper. Pedro has flaws, but he's not dangerous. He's not unstable. He's the most grounded person I know. Valerie tried to interrupt, but the judge raised a hand. Gianna continued. And those girls? They've been loved, deeply, seen in ways they hadn't been before. The judge turned. Genesis Brighton, would you like to speak? Genesis stood. She didn't shake, didn't pause. We are not lost children, she said. We are not bargaining chips. We are not a name or a legacy or a bank account. We are people. And Pedro was the first person who treated us like that. She looked at the judge, eyes unwavering. Please don't make us leave home again. The courtroom fell still. Judge Avery leaned back. I'll review all submitted evidence. A decision will be made within 48 hours. He gavelled the hearing closed. Pedro turned to the girls, reaching for Josie's hand. But Genesis reached first, and she didn't let go. Rain tapped against the windows of the penthouse like a soft warning. It was the kind of rain Charleston was famous for, persistent, whispering through the streets and sliding down glass like time refusing to stop. Pedro stood near the floor-to-ceiling window in the living room, hands in his pockets, watching the sky blend into the harbor. Behind him, Genesis sat on the edge of the couch, arms wrapped around her knees, still in the same clothes she'd worn to the courthouse the day before. Josie was asleep, curled up in Pedro's chair with a blanket pulled to her chin. Her rabbit rested beside her, ears bent, threadbare. They were waiting for a decision, waiting to know if the word home would mean anything tomorrow. Pedro turned from the window and looked at Genesis. You should rest. She shook her head. If I sleep, I'll dream. And if I dream, I'll think it's over. I'd rather just wait. He crossed the room, sat beside her. Not too close, just enough that she knew he was there. She was brave, he said softly, nodding toward Josie. You both were. Genesis stared at the floor. She didn't even cry until we got back. Pedro looked at her. And you? She laughed, bitter and quiet. I don't cry in front of people, that's rule 1. You don't have to follow that rule here. She didn't answer. Outside, thunder rolled low across the sky, a distant sound that felt too much like a warning. Sutton arrived just before noon, soaked from the rain, hair damp, coat slung over his arm. Pedro met him at the door, searching his face before a single word was spoken. Well? Pedro asked. Sutton didn't answer right away. He dropped the coat over a chair, pulled out a folder from his bag, and set it down on the kitchen island. Then he looked at Pedro and Genesis. She's pushing again, he said. Valerie filed a motion for expedited judgment. They want a ruling by tomorrow morning. They're claiming emotional manipulation now, saying you encouraged the girls to speak at the hearing as a media tactic. Pedro shook his head slowly. They're trying to exhaust us. They're trying to make you walk away, Sutton said. But you won't. No, Pedro said. I won't. Genesis stood. What happens now? Sutton looked at her, softer than Pedro had ever seen. Now? Now we hold the line. There was a knock at the door. Pedro froze. Sutton raised an eyebrow. Expecting someone? No. Pedro opened the door to find Judge Nadine Holt standing in the hallway. No coat, no umbrella. Just her, hair pulled back, eyes sharp and kind all at once. Can I come in? She asked. Pedro stepped aside quickly. "Of course, I wasn't expecting—" "I know," she said, "but I have something that couldn't wait for a call." Genesis stood straight. Josie, still wrapped in her blanket, peeked from the couch. Judge Holt looked at them, then back at Pedro. "I requested to review the emergency hearing files personally," she said. "I've spent the last 12 hours reading Eve." Pedro's chest tightened. She looked at Genesis. "And I watched the footage from the press conference and the courthouse." Genesis blinked quickly but said nothing. "Judge Avery will deliver his ruling in the morning," Holt continued. "But I came here tonight because there's something you all need to understand." She paused, looked at Pedro. "You may not be their blood, Mr. Whitaker, but you've acted with more integrity and intention than most legal guardians I've ever seen." Then she looked at Genesis. "And you're not a child in the eyes of the court, but you are in the eyes of your sister. And you've been her anchor. I've seen what that kind of love looks like." Genesis's lips trembled just once. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Judge Holt said gently, "know this, you've already changed the story. No matter the outcome, that matters." She turned to leave, but Pedro stopped her. "Judge, if you were the one making the decision, would you send them back?" She met his eyes. "No." And then she was gone. The door closed behind her with the softest click, but the air inside the room had changed. Pedro turned, but Genesis had already walked away, slipping into the guest room and shutting the door quietly behind her. He didn't follow. Not yet. Instead, he crossed to the couch, knelt beside Josie, who was still curled into her cocoon of blankets. She blinked at him sleepily. "Did we win?" He brushed her hair back. "Not yet, but someone very smart thinks we might." "Good," she whispered, "because I want to stay." Pedro swallowed hard. "Me too." Later that night, when the storm returned, Pedro stood outside Genesis's door, listening. He heard the soft sound of crying, barely there. No sobs. Just that quiet, breathless ache of someone who'd held it in too long. He didn't knock, didn't speak. He just sat down outside her door and waited, until the silence on the other side matched the stillness in his chest. And both finally meant something close to peace. The morning arrived with a strange kind of stillness, too quiet for a city that usually hummed with early movement. It was the kind of hush that pressed against windows and stretched across the sky, like the world itself was waiting. Pedro stood in the hallway outside the girls' room, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. He could hear them talking inside, low, familiar whispers that reminded him of sleepovers and secrets. Genesis emerged first, fully dressed, her braid neat, chin lifted with quiet resolve. Josie followed in a navy cardigan, her small hand wrapped around her sister's. Neither of them spoke as they reached the kitchen. They didn't need to. Sutton arrived minutes later, carrying a manila envelope, his face unreadable. He looked over at Pedro as if to ask, "Are you ready?" Pedro nodded once. They drove in silence. The courthouse was already surrounded. Press vans, photographers, security volunteers, even strangers with signs, people Pedro didn't know, holding messages like, "Let them stay," and "Family is more than blood." Inside, the courtroom was cooler than usual, the lights harsher, the energy tighter. Judge Avery took the bench. Pedro noticed Judge Holt seated in the back, a quiet presence in a sea of formality. Sylvia Brighton sat with Valerie Heath, poised and pristine, expression unreadable. Genesis reached for Pedro's hand. He gave it without hesitation. Judge Avery cleared his throat and began. After reviewing all submitted evidence, including third-party testimony, medical documentation, personal statements, and live witness accounts, this court has made its decision regarding the temporary and future custody of Genesis and Josie Brighton. Pedro felt his heartbeat in his fingertips. The petition to remove the minors from Mr. Pedro Whitaker's care is denied. Gasps rippled through the room. Josie gripped her sister's arm tightly. Genesis didn't move. Avery continued. Furthermore, the court finds Mr. Whitaker's conduct to be in alignment with the best interests of the children. His willingness to provide a safe, emotionally stable, and nurturing environment has been confirmed by external evaluations. Pedro couldn't move, could barely breathe. The court also recognizes the clarity and maturity of Genesis Brighton's testimony and the deep, consistent bond between both children and Mr. Whitaker. Then, one final sentence. This court grants Mr. Pedro Whitaker full temporary guardianship, with immediate steps toward permanent adoption. A hush followed. No one spoke. No one moved. Then Josie burst into tears, not loud or panicked, just soft, overwhelmed sobs that folded her into her sister's arms. Genesis held her tightly. Pedro covered his mouth, swallowing a breath that tasted like salt, and something he hadn't felt in years. Relief. Real, shaking, bone-deep relief. Sylvia stood slowly, her face still calm, but her jaw tight. She leaned toward Valerie, whispered something clipped and sharp. Then she turned and walked out without a word. Pedro didn't watch her go. He only looked at the girls. Sutton placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it." "No," Pedro said. "We did." Outside the courthouse, the light had changed. Softer. Gold around the edges, like the sky was exhaling too. People clapped quietly as they passed, not for a spectacle, not for drama, for something that felt like hope. Back at the house, Josie fell asleep on the couch before lunch, her rabbit tucked under her arm, breathing slow and even. Genesis sat on the floor in front of the fireplace, her arms wrapped around her knees. Pedro knelt beside her. "You okay?" "I don't think I believe it yet," she said. "You don't have to. Not all at once." She looked at him, voice low. "I kept thinking, what if they took her? What if I couldn't stop it this time?" Pedro didn't respond with words. He simply reached for her hand again, and this time she let him hold it longer. After a while, she whispered, "You didn't just save us." Pedro frowned. "What do you mean?" "You made us real again." He stared at her, the quiet power of those words sinking in deeper than anything that had come before. Then, in the calm of the late afternoon, Genesis did something she hadn't done in weeks. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for the first time, she let herself rest. The late spring light poured through the kitchen windows like a soft memory, the kind of golden haze that made time feel slower, like the day itself was pausing to let you breathe. Josie stood at the island with a spatula in one hand, a smear of chocolate frosting on her cheek, and a deep, determined crease in her brow. "I think this one's crooked," she declared, staring at the 3-layer cake they were attempting to assemble. "It's leaning like a tired house." Pedro chuckled from across the counter. "We'll call it rustic." Josie grinned, clearly satisfied with the term. Rustic is fancy for oops. Genesis sat nearby with her legs tucked under her, peeling the stickers off a fresh notebook. One Pedro had left on her bed that morning. The cover was dark green, with gold foil edges and thick, creamy pages. She hadn't said thank you yet, but she'd opened it, and that meant more than words. "Are we still going to the cottage tonight?" she asked without looking up. Pedro wiped his hands on a towel. "We are. I figured we'd let this masterpiece of a cake cool, pack up, and head out around 4. Josie clapped. "Can I pick the music for the car?" "If it's not all show tunes," Pedro replied. She gave him a sly look. "No promises." The car ride out to Sullivan's Island was filled with soft harmonies, windows cracked just enough to let the salt air drift in. Pedro kept one hand on the wheel, and the other resting near the console, close enough that he could feel the energy between the girls. Genesis, humming quietly, notebook open in her lap. Josie, legs swinging as she held the cake on her lap like it was made of glass. They pulled into the gravel driveway just as the sun began to stretch long across the grass. Pedro stepped out first, pausing for a moment, just to listen. The sea, the birds, the rustle of wind through live oaks. Home. Josie ran toward the porch and dropped onto the steps. I forgot how good this place smells, like sand and toast. Genesis followed slowly, her eyes lingering on the porch swing, the shells still arranged in the shape Josie had left them weeks ago. Pedro unlocked the door and held it open. Welcome back. Inside, everything was just as they'd left it. Faint traces of lavender from the oil diffuser, the soft hum of the fridge. Even Lincoln the cat, June's gift, stretched out by the window, barely lifting his head in acknowledgement. Genesis set the notebook on the kitchen table, her fingers brushing the spine like she didn't quite want to let go. Pedro leaned against the counter. You brought it. She nodded. It's easier to breathe when it's near. Think you'll start writing? Maybe, if I can figure out where to begin. You already have. That night, after dinner, they brought the cake outside. The wind had picked up slightly, tousling Josie's hair as she carried the plate to the table beneath the string lights. Genesis followed with the forks, careful, precise as always. Pedro lit a few candles, their flames flickering like tiny heartbeats. Josie sat on her knees, looking up at the stars. Can we stay here forever? Pedro smiled. You'd get bored after a week. Nope, she said with certainty. Not even after 1,000,000 years. Genesis gave him a small look across the table. She's not wrong. The cake leaned slightly to the left. It didn't matter. They ate with laughter and smudged napkins and chocolate on their fingers. Josie talked with her mouth full. Genesis didn't stop her. Afterward, Josie wandered toward the porch swing, humming a quiet tune, rabbit tucked under her arm. She moved slower now, but with ease, like she wasn't waiting for something bad to follow the good. Pedro turned to Genesis, who stood watching the sea beyond the dunes. Tomorrow, he said softly, we start the final paperwork. She nodded. It doesn't feel real yet. It will. Genesis looked down, her voice small. You're not doing this because you feel sorry for us, right? Pedro stepped closer. Number, I'm doing it because I can't imagine this house, or my life, without you in it. She blinked hard. But we're complicated. So am I. Her breath caught. She turned toward him then, her voice barely more than a whisper. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for you to realize it's too hard. Pedro knelt slightly, meeting her eyes. Genesis, hard is not the same as wrong. You're not hard. You're worth it. A pause. And then, slowly, carefully, she reached out and wrapped her arms around him. It wasn't quick. It wasn't unsure. It was the kind of hug that only came after miles of silence and years of holding everything in. Pedro held her tightly, not to rescue her, but to tell her he wasn't going anywhere. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. Josie called from the porch, her voice gentle, sleepy. Genesis, do you think Mom and Dad would be proud of us? Genesis turned, her voice steady. I think they already are. Pedro watched them walk back toward the swing side by side. And for the first time since it all began, he didn't feel like he was watching someone else's story. This was his. And he was right where he was meant to be. The courthouse lawn looked different in spring. Softer, quieter. The trees had bloomed with delicate pink blossoms, and somewhere nearby, wind chimes played a slow, uncertain tune. Pedro stood beneath one of the old oaks, a manila envelope tucked under his arm. His suit was pressed, his shoes clean, but his heart felt anything but polished. It was full, stretched wide and aching in the best kind of way. He looked up at the building where everything had changed. Not just legally, but permanently. Behind him, footsteps approached. Genesis, no longer just a girl fighting to be heard, but something steadier, someone becoming. "It's official," Pedro said, lifting the envelope slightly. "The judge signed this morning. Permanent guardianship. Adoption finalized." She exhaled, slow and quiet. "So that's it?" "That's it." A breeze tugged at her braid. She looked at the envelope like it might disappear if she blinked. Then her voice cracked just a little. "What do we call you now?" Pedro smiled. "You've called me Pedro all this time. I think that's earned." "I know," she whispered. "But if we wanted to call you something else—" He waited. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. From the steps, Josie came bounding down toward them, hair loose, smile wide, clutching a folded paper in one hand. "I drew us," she announced. "You, me, and Pedro, and Lincoln, and Cake." Genesis took the drawing gently. "It's beautiful." Josie beamed, then looked up at Pedro. "You're coming to the tree, right?" "I wouldn't miss it." They walked together to a quiet patch of land just beyond the garden path, where Pedro had planted a flowering dogwood weeks earlier. A tree for starting over, for promises kept. Josie knelt beside it and placed a small stone at its base. Genesis followed with one of her mother's piano sheet pages, laminated and trimmed, tucked into the soil like a letter that never got mailed. Pedro reached into his coat and pulled out something small, a brass key. He handed it to Genesis. She stared at it. "What's this?" "A new house," he said softly. "The one on Meeting Street, with the blue shutters, and the breakfast nook she kept asking for." Josie gasped. "Really?" "I closed on it yesterday. It's ours." Genesis looked down at the key, then back at him. "We have a mailbox now?" Josie asked. Pedro smiled. "We do." Genesis blinked quickly, then tucked the key in her pocket. "You didn't have to do all this," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I did." They stood there for a long while, listening to the wind and the faint rustling of new leaves, and in that quiet, between breath and blossom, something settled. Not the end of a fight, the beginning of a life. Home. If you enjoyed this video, comment 1 to let me know. If not, comment 2. Your thoughts matter to me either way.